Hello, and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. In this episode, Nathan and I wrap up our discussion of Metal Gear Solid 2 by talking about the trippy sequence in the game's final location. After that, I discuss my early impressions of Metal Gear Solid 3. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
So in our conversation about Metal Gear Solid 2 last episode, we basically left entirely untouched to that section where you wake up in Arsenal Gear as Raiden, you're naked, and then you have to run around naked, maybe catch a cold, and then you fight the Metal Gears, and then you fight Solidus Snake. So a lot happens. It's a very compressed section, but there's so much going on, including the glitching kernel and all the UI manipulations. So there's a ton to talk about. So we'd be remiss if we didn't at least pay some respect to this very famous surreal climax of Metal Gear Solid 2 before moving on to Metal Gear Solid 3, which is what we'll be covering. I say in anticipation we'll be covering for the most of this episode, the majority of this episode, but TBD on how that works out. So we're doing a little splitsies here between the end of Metal Gear Solid 2 and however much of Snake Eater we want to cover.
Yeah, so I think I know I texted you while I was playing through the end of that part where as you say, a lot happens, and it is really, it feels, I don't know how to put it. It does feel very compressed. There was like another thing I was thinking of, but I mean, you also like fight alongside Snake, so he kind of returns, right? And I think it's during that section where I forget if Snake dies or if Snake gets wounded or something, the screen will kind of zoom out like that, because we haven't really touched on the game over screen or whatever, where it will sort of show the little image in the corner, but it will do that, but it will say, I forget exactly what it says. It's like something that rhymes with game over.
It's mission mailed instead of mission
Mission
failed.
failed, that's right. Yeah. Mission fission mailed. And then it kind of tries to trick you into stopping, stop moving around with your character so that you actually do get killed. So there are all these things that begin to almost infect like the UI, as you said, to such an extent where there was one point where I told you about this. This happened, and actually something similar happened when I was playing Snake Eater as well, which is very irritating. But I beat the section where you have to kill, I think it's like 25 of the Metal Gear things. Um, and it took a few tries because it is a little, you have to get it's really timing based because you're just firing off these missiles at them and you have to keep continuously dodging, and you have to hit each one I think three times for them to die, and they just keep coming back, so there are always three at a time. But I finally did it, and I breathed a sigh of relief, and then the screen, it was going into a cutscene, and I think the screen became kind of like red, and then it just became totally black, and I assumed like, okay, I'm just gonna wait a second and it's gonna be a cutscene. And then I waited about 10 seconds and I thought, okay, well, oh, I just had all this weird stuff happen with the UI, so now this is going to be a cutscene that's kind of messing with me or whatever, right? And so I even put it down after a while. I think 10 minutes had passed or something, and the screen was, it was still backlit, but it was totally black. And then I realized what had happened. It just kind of stalled out. And this did happen again in a slightly different way, but also similarly right after a boss fight, in Metal Gear 3. I am playing these both on the Switch, or I did play them both on the Switch, so I don't know if this is unique to the Switch or if this has happened on other consoles, but it is just an interesting thing where you think that I'm trying to think of other examples of this in other mediums where uh, the work is so bizarre that a glitch seems to belong to it. I mean, I know you've obviously written about this at length. I can think of some music actually where I had a CD of some, really weird experimental electronic music, and it was skipping, and I couldn't tell if it was skipping or not. So it's a strange experience where the actual medium uh, seems to be implicated in a way that you don't really know if it's intentional by the actual work or if it's a flaw.
Yeah. Do you, so you mentioned dying during the fission mailed screen. Did that actually happen? Because I'm realizing now I've never actually died, and I'm curious to know if it changes to the actual game over screen and not the parodic game over screen. Or if you die and all the last thing you see as a player is fission mailed.
Yeah, I actually don't think I did die. So I was just assuming that it was kind of a trick to get you
Yeah.
to stop moving so that you did die. That was like but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you just can't die during that part. I don't know.
That's one of those stats that like the sort of fantasy statistics that I don't, it seems impossible to record with accuracy, but I would love to know. I mean, it just is impossible, but I would love to know how many, especially back in 2001, how many players actually died during that screen.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, um, it reminds me of in Metal Gear Solid. I say it reminds me like this is like something that I thought of, but it's just a very basic connection. In Metal Gear Solid 1, when you're fighting Psycho Mantis, who is a boss who also his power, he's a psychic, and it extends to the systemic interactions of the console.
right.
So famously, he does this thing where he's like, I'm going to make your controller move. And then you put your controller on the ground and he rumbles the vibration, which at that time was a brand new feature. Like, that like no one, it was a totally novel thing for your controller to have rumble built in. And so the controller would move. And the idea was actually some people might be confused by the controller moving because they had never experimented with that before.
Yeah.
Um, he'll also say, I'm going to read your mind. And then what he does is look at your system memory. And if he sees any Konami games, he'll be like, "Oh, you like Silent Hill, don't you?" Because Silent Hill was published by Konami. Um, and the one that really uh, connects or resembles the Metal Gear Solid 2 moment is your screen will cut to black and you'll get a little green on the upper right hand corner of the screen, a little those old, I forget what they're called, the TVs that have the that you use like video one, video two, video three, right? Not HDMI, so pre-HD TVs.
Yeah, yeah.
And it'll flash black with this green blinking indicator that reads Hideo or Hideo
Mm.
instead of video. And it's easy to miss, so you can actually think that your TV has just cut out or something, or you're, in the middle of the boss and you start panicking. I think you're like, oh my, the intended or the ideal player might run over to check their TV, and then the boss fight jumps back in, and maybe you die while you're sort of up from the couch or whatever. So that's a case where the game in Metal Gear Solid 1, the game is simulating a systemic fail state, whereas in Metal Gear Solid 2, it's simulating a gameplay fail state, Or system is actually not, system's a difficult word here because it could mean, I suppose Metal Gear Solid 2 is systemic as well, but I'm talking like hardware systemic, like
Mm.
your audio visual setup, not or your console, not so much the game itself. Um, it's a really fascinating device, and one that the Metal Gear games use a fair amount. I mean, you have some of that in Metal Gear Solid 3 as well, but it's fairly unusual. Like I can't think of any other AAA big budget action games that are messing with the hardware or simulating disruptions to the hardware.
Yeah, this is making me think. I mean, this might be a little bit of a tangent, but I'm thinking now of playing Oikospiel with Michael Barr, a little while ago, and the way in which that game, I think we discussed how strange it was and how much it is playing around with like the idea of a game in the first place, and I think for one, there's kind of no fail state. You can kind of jump through everything, but the game is constantly shifting the rules and what you're supposed to be doing or what your orienting goal is at any given moment. And I just think that I mean, I had fun playing that game and it was great to discuss, but I think that what's happening on like a systems level or even just like the parameters of the game level in Metal Gear is so much more successful, right? Because we're so um, for one, this doesn't happen until later in the game, right? Like in Metal Gear Solid 2, at least, there's not really. too much going on with the UI. Like it is, as we've kind of, or at least as I've said, it's kind of a tricky one to get used to. But I do think that, around halfway through the game, I can't remember if I mentioned this last time or not, but it really flipped for me where I became totally like intimately uh familiar with the controls and didn't really have to think about it anymore, you know? And so by the
Yeah.
time that happens, there's a little bit more time that goes by, and then these weird things start happening where okay, I get the controls now, the controls are all good, but well, now I just lost all my weapons, and now the general guy or whatever is glitching out, and now it's trying to, make me stop moving my character with this fake fail state screen. And then, then the actual glitch that happened where I had to restart and then play through an entire boss battle again, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, there's a certain level of like payoff that you get, I think, or that the game achieves through having you really train actually on the controls, which maybe speaks a little bit to the thematic stuff that's happening with Raiden as well, right? Like we get trained on those controls and then they get kind of warped or somehow altered later in the game.
Yeah. Yeah. And what you said about Oikospiel, or I think I would abstract this more generally to different kinds of mimetic or formal violation in art.
Mhm.
Um, I think that almost to sort of rephrase or modify what you're saying, like I think part of what makes these moments of systemic failure or simulated systemic failure and formal disruption in Metal Gear Solid 2 so powerful is precisely that the game has given us an illusion to believe in. Like we talked in our first episode about how extraordinarily granular the simulation is in this game. Like not the simulation, the Solid Snake simulation, but just the simulation of physical reality. I mean, this particularly when you put it in context with other games from 2001. I mean, it's just like it's an entirely different universe. And I think I said on that first podcast that it also has more sort of systemic dynamism in its physical simulation than most games do today. In
Yeah.
fact, like several degrees more phenomenological like thickness than almost any game on the market now. Even
Mhm.
a game that's supposedly very, simulating a lot, like Red Dead Redemption 2. It's Metal Gear Solid 2, I think, blows it out of the water. Not in terms of its scope, but in terms of just how um, complicated the interactions with reality are. Uh, so the game has established this incredibly rich world, and then it goes on to disrupt it. It's sort of like to me, this is a very crude example and it oversimplifies things, but it's the difference between, looking at a cubist painting and looking at, a sort of bit of conceptual modern art where it's like a blank canvas with a splatter on it, and the blank canvas is saying whatever. Art isn't, the illusion of art is secondary or precisely that what we think of as representation in painting is illusory, is fake, is ideological. Here's the truth of painting, which is just a flat canvas with some pigment on it or whatever. It's making this kind of argument and has a kind of supposedly a kind of shock value or whatever. But that kind of art for me is just frankly so much less effective and interesting than an art, a tradition like Cubism, which has completely internalized the grammar of pictorial representation, and in fact is playing off that and still using it and fundamentally still trusting it to some degree. TJ Clark, the art critic TJ Clark, has this beautiful chapter in his book A Farewell to an Idea, which is it's sort of larger history of a broad history of modernism in painting, and he talks about how Cubism still has this fundamental commitment to to the rendering of light and shadow, and that this is a kind of like baseline mimetic intention that even though it gets quote unquote distorted by Cubist style, so like eyeballs are like on both sides of the, you can see both eyeballs in profile for in a portrait, for example. um, Light and shadow are still doing work there, and therefore we still have this basic reality
Mhm.
that's being represented, despite these modulations of pictorial convention. And Metal Gear is doing, I think, I guess it seems pretentious to say it's doing something similar. I would more just say that like the feeling I get from playing Metal Gear and experiencing those moments of yeah, flagrant violation of realism feel like the feeling is similar. It's a similar sense of sort of immersion or rather engrossment and attention and pleasure, I think.
Yeah, that's, yeah, this is giving me a few avenues to think about. I mean, first, I feel like one thing I would note, and I obviously haven't spent as much time playing this game as I have with the Fallout series, which we're, going to talk about at some point soon, I think. Um, the interaction with the environment is complex, but it seems really reliable in Metal Gear as far as I can tell. Whereas in a game like Fallout or, the Elder Scrolls series, you can interact with, not only the environment, but other characters. You can attack characters or kill characters or whatever that you're not supposed to. And sometimes I mean, it can kind of ruin your game. It can glitch your game. It can do all these kind of weird things. And I'm sure that's partly a function of just like how much, I mean, I have no clue about this, but I'm imagining that it's just partly due to how much, data or memory the game is taking up with some of those larger scale games. But I do think that's something that's really the precision of the Metal Gear games, like both the precision that they demand from you in terms of combat and sneaking and everything, but also the precision that they give back to you in terms of what happens when you do certain things is pretty remarkable. Um, I really like your point there about I guess like representation or representationalism, and I wonder because I'm thinking now, and maybe this is a little bit too far afield, so we could always cut it. But you're mentioning because I tend to agree. I mean, not only do I prefer cubism to totally abstract painting, but I would prefer I don't know, Bruegel to cubism or something like this, right? Like it turns out I'm much more of a representationalist. Um, but this idea of pictorial convention, it makes me think or makes me wonder about if this is a contradiction from what you said a few weeks ago when we were talking about music, because I think you kind of mentioned you don't like music that seems pictorial. I think that might have actually been the term you used, and I would agree. But I wonder then, and again, this is totally a tangent, but I think it's worth at least planting the seed to think about this for now or for later.
Yeah, I think for me my reflex answer is the difference is that music doesn't actually have pictorial content, so it seems
Sure.
sort of vain to attempt to to simulate it, you know. But
Hmm.
I definitely would need to think more about this.
Hmm.
It's something that's kind of an sort of off the cuff thought that I haven't really pursued, partly because, as you know, I hate music, or I don't listen to enough music. I wish that I want to listen to more music seriously, you know, not ambiently, which is I do plenty of, but actually
Yeah.
like make the sitting down and just being like, okay, I'm going to pay attention to this music, you know, and have like a sort of a richer, attentive experience. Um, one more thing before we leave the Arsenal gear section. What did you think of the sword? You get the sword and then you fight through all those samurai soldiers.
I mean, I really liked that part. I think again, like you, uh, maybe because I was already trained to have the somewhat unconventional, gun mechanics, the sword was a much quicker learning curve for me. So I liked that part, and I think it was kind of a refreshing change of pace for the game, and again, a surprising one, right? But even going back to what we were just kind of saying in terms of like the maybe the proportion of the game or something, like how surprising that was seems kind of just on par with what's already been happening in the game, right? Like I was not surprised to be surprised at this point in the game, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it is striking. I noticed this too on replay that Metal Gear Solid 2 is somewhat relentless in switching up what you're actually doing on a gameplay level. You know,
Yeah.
for a game, for a series that has such a solid and fleshed out and, as you say, sort of reliable and precise um, gameplay core. You
Mhm.
know, Metal Gear is 2 is like, okay, now you're taking pictures. Okay, now you're freezing bombs. Like, boss fight, now you're escorting Emma. Oh, now you have this brand new control system with a sword that you actually control with the analog stick. So you're like manually inputting the direction of your slashes. Like,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
alone is so emblematic of the way that Kojima designs games. He I've said this before, and I'll say it again, even though I'm not the only one to believe this. But like, Kojima is a much better game designer than he is a storyteller. I think. Like
Mhm.
at the end of the day, I like his games because they're brilliant games. And
Yeah,
what's funny about them is that they devote so many resources and so much energy and demand so much attention on the narrative side. But really, like, you know, what other game would give you a sword at the very end and have like, you know, not just a new control scheme, but in some ways a new control scheme for the game medium? Like,
right.
what if we had a sword where you actually are controlling the way that you slash? You know,
Yeah, yeah,
that's amazing. It feels gimmicky, but gimmicky in a way that is totally intentional and thought through, and curious, you know, in just finding other ways to manipulate avatars and exist in a world and perform these game actions that we've become so habituated to. Um, the other thing I want to say about that sequence is, and this is in a way kind of like an audio note for myself. So apologies to you and also to our listeners, but um, I wanted to maybe get this on record because I was playing Metal Gear Solid 4 recently. I think I've mentioned this on this podcast that
yeah,
I played the whole series this semester. Um, and there's something really interesting that happens with those like ninja soldiers in Metal Gear Solid 4. So do you mind if I just like try to articulate
yeah.
what's
Go
out
for it.
in 4, even though we're not going to play 4 because it's locked to PlayStation 3, so there's no way you could even, I mean, I guess you could secure a PlayStation 3, but it just seems like a pain in the ass. But 4 is amazing. It's an incredible game. It's just as good as 3 in a lot of ways, and it is the proper sequel to Metal Gear Solid 2, so it picks up a lot of the threads, or all of the threads, actually. In fact, what's sort of insane and grandiose and comic about it is that it tries to say everything. It's one of the only games I've played that tries to say everything about the series and bring in every single thread. Um, and part of that is this sort of mad act of synthesis where the game will has this flashback mechanic where if a character mentions something in a cutscene from Metal Gear Solid 1 or even from the 1980s Metal Gear games, you can press X and you'll be rewarded with a few points that you can spend to buy gun upgrades and stuff. But the main reward is to get a flash, sort of the screen transitions in a different tone so that it's sort of indicating to you that, you know, it's maybe staticky or something. I forget exactly how it works, that you're now experiencing a flashback. But the flashback is to whatever the thing, the original object of reference. So if somebody says, you know, um, Fat Man or something, and then you can press X and you'll see images of Fat Man from Metal Gear Solid 2. And this is true for every generation of Metal Gear. So at the time of Metal Gear Solid 4, which is PS3, you're therefore in game flashing back to images of the PS2 generation, the PS1 generation, and the I forget actually what the system was. It wasn't NES or Super NES. It was something else that the original Metal Gears were on. So you're flashing back to three separate generations of representational style um, that are all being seamlessly integrated and put on the same level of reality. So there is something just striking and bizarre in that, like, you know, you're here at the height of graphical advancement prowess. Like Metal Gear Solid 4 was the best looking game of its time um, in 2008 or whenever that game came out. And you're then confronted with a pixelated rendering of Liquid Snake from the PlayStation 1 from 10 years ago, you know. And the game is putting all these different representational styles on the same level, which is quite fascinating. You know, a Naughty Dog game, for example, would up res the image. So like if you're remembering something that happened, if it this doesn't happen, in Uncharted 4, right? If Nathan Drake remembered something that happened in Uncharted 1, I have full confidence that maybe I'm wrong here and I'm just forgetting something, but that the you know, the designers would represent that flashback in the graphics of Uncharted 4 in PS4 graphics so that everything is on the same level of representational quality. Um, Metal Gear is a pretty unique, I mean, even within the larger sort of spectrum of representational modes and forms, it seems pretty unique to have all of these different ways of depicting the fictional world all smushed together into one text, you know, and treated as equally real and equally serious. So they'll mention Big Boss, and you'll see like an 8-bit Big Boss, you
Hmm.
know, and it's like that's just supposed to be real. That's what the characters are remembering, which is somewhat crazy. So that active synthesis is happening on the representational level, but the thing I wanted to mention is something that's actually happening on a gameplay level. But it looks like you had a thought. Did you want to jump in here?
Well, yeah, just quickly, I would say then that because my originally my question was going to be whether those flashbacks were upgraded or not. So the fact that they're not feels like it's doing something again beyond what we could imagine as like a stylistic mashup of different graphical things, right? Because you could imagine a game um, that would do that, that would switch. I mean, even again, Oikospiel kind of did some version of that. Obviously not in flashback style, but we noted a little bit at least how the different sections of the game will have different style or aesthetics or whatever. Um, so I guess again, I'm not really sure what that means or what that's doing, but that seems like a pretty, especially given just the whole, mythology and narrative of Metal Gear, that seems like a pretty interesting uh move to make in terms of what that means diegetically for the characters too.
Yeah, and I'll note that it does happen in Metal Gear Solid 2. It's not player initiated. There's no button prompt, but when in that the final scene in the Tanker chapter when Liquid Snake's hand takes over Ocelot's body and mind, there are sort of quick cuts, flashes to Liquid Snake in Metal Gear Solid 1, and he's pixelated and looks totally different from how the characters look in Metal Gear Solid 2. There's at least one instance, or maybe more, but I'm only remembering one, where that game is already doing this thing where it's treating the far more primitive sort of representational style of Metal Gear, technically limited, technologically limited representational style of Metal Gear Solid 1 as canon, as it were, and putting it on the same level of reality as the then totally cutting edge graphics of Metal Gear Solid 2. Um, Okay, so but here's the thing I wanted to make a note of, which is the big it was the big discovery for me of replaying Metal Gear Solid 4, which is that in that game there are these enemies called frogs, and the frogs are the super super high tech soldiers. They behave a lot like the Arsenal Tengus, so they sort of jump around. They can jump really high. They seem kind of weightless. They're in black cyborg armor. They don't really appear to be human, or at least seem to be robotically enhanced, right? Modified. And like the Arsenal Tengu or the Arsenal Gear soldiers, they're more difficult. Like they're supposed to be like they're a greater challenge in theory and take more bullets to put down. So in the fiction of Metal Gear, these guys are like and in the larger series, they're like the most advanced regular enemy that you'll fight in the entire series. Both chronologically within the game world because Metal Gear Solid 4 is the furthest game into the Metal Gear Solid games, the furthest one in the future, and also just on a basic like gameplay level. I think they're the hardest enemies. I find them the most difficult. But what's striking is that their difficulty is partly a function of the fact that they literalize and motivate the way the guards behave in Metal Gear Solid 1. So in Metal Gear Solid 1, there are two distinguishing features of the guards relative to the guards in the rest of the series. The first one is that you can't headshot them because you can't aim in first person. So to shoot a guard, you have to just blindly shoot at them using square. You know, when you take out your weapon with square or whatever the, X, and you can just kind of like shoot without aiming, and it takes like a bunch of bullets to take down a guy because you're just sort of shooting them in the body. So that's the only way you can shoot in Metal Gear Solid 1. And the second thing is that guards in Metal Gear Solid 1 disappear. Uh, so there's no hiding bodies. After they die, they vanish. And what's really striking again is that in Metal Gear Solid 4, when you reach the apogee of technical advancement within the fiction, the guards behave the same way. So the frogs, which are like the PS3 version of the Arsenal Tengus, they will disappear when they die. So they disintegrate when they die, as opposed to all the other enemies in Metal Gear for like the other ones where you have to hide the bodies, right? And the bodies have a kind of very complicated sort of physics and noticing system. Um, the other thing is that although you can headshot them by shooting this one tiny little spot on their helmet, it's for all intents and purposes like impossible to headshot them if you're in combat because it's really hard to aim, at least for me. So you basically have to take them down with body shots. So again, and oh, and lastly, like as you shoot them in the body, they scream at each bullet, which is exactly how the guards behave in Metal Gear Solid 1. So in Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3, like I don't think the guards may make reactions, but they don't like shout. Whereas in Metal Gear Solid 1, when you shoot a guard, they go like each time for each bullet that hits them. And that's exactly how the guards behave, how these special guards behave in Metal Gear Solid 4. But all of these things that are happening in 4 are diegetically motivated. Like they disappear because they have these nanomachines that are just sort of evaporating the bodies. I forget why. Maybe it's so people can't get the tech, or maybe it's because they're so juiced up or something that they just sort of short circuit and explode when they die. Um, you can't headshot them because of their ultra advanced cybernetic armor. And they have this sort of echoing metallic voice because they're cyborgs. Whereas in Metal Gear Solid 1, it kind of just feels like it's like a compressed audio sample or something. Like they're just not, the guards are not going to talk like humans. They echo in this really interesting way. So all of these features of guard behavior, and I'm sorry to harp on this for so long, but again, like guard behavior for me, like is Metal Gear Solid. Like that's the core, that's the true core of the series. All of these features of guard behavior from the first game that seem to be functions of technological limitation are literalized in Metal Gear Solid 4 as a kind of homage or a return to like how it felt to play Metal Gear Solid 1, but in a completely motivated way, which is a really striking thing that I don't think I've seen in any other video game. So it would be sort of like, you know, it would be as if you were playing, I guess to stick with Metal Gear Solid, like the game had some reason why suddenly it became a 2D game, And there was like, because the original games were 2D, you then are playing in 2D, and the game is like, oh no, this is because like whatever, Arsenal Gear has brainwashed Raiden into thinking that he's 2D or whatever. That actually seems somewhat weirdly plausible, But motivating a technological limitation, or motivating a representational deficiency, right, from a previous entry in the series within the same fictional universe, the same diegetic timeline, um, a deficiency that was a result of purely technological limitation. But with the alibi now that it's actually all these things that were signs of technological limitation are now signs of technological advancement within the world because these soldiers are so robotic.
Right. So I wonder then if that like retroactively does something to the original ones within the fiction of the game.
Yeah.
Right. Like if it sheds some kind of like uh yeah, some reverse light on the original mechanics. I wonder.
Yeah, like you could say, oh, well, those soldiers at Shadow Moses were actually like the prototypes for the cyborg soldiers in Metal Gear Solid 4, which is the kind of thing that a Metal Gear game would do.
Right.
The fact that it seems technologically implausible doesn't matter because there are cyborg soldiers in Metal Gear Solid 5, and that game is set in the 1980s. And
Hmm.
you also fight like robot soldiers in that. And the tech that Snake has access to is like better than the tech in the other games, even though
Well,
he's still talking on a walkie-talkie, but he has like this super powered like smartphone radar like tablet thing that can do everything and has like 3D renders of the entire like map of Afghanistan and stuff. It's crazy.
well.
So the series doesn't really care or is very loosey-goosey about like matching the technological capacities to the historical moment. And it becomes increasingly so. I think maybe this is a good transition to Metal Gear Solid 3 because that is a game where it does seem like it at least starts from a point of taking the tech limitations of its historical setting seriously, right? We have no radar, we have no codec, although the radio is functionally identical.
Mhm.
Um, but the absence of radar is the maybe the main the most noticeable gameplay change at first. And for me, sorry to talk so much, but like I think maybe the number one failure of that game or missed opportunity is that they give you all of this sort of um, suite of uh, other items that are supposed to compensate for the lack of a radar. So you have like a motion detector, you have a sonar, um, and I just never touched that shit. Like it just seems way too clunky and unreliable. I'd rather just use my eyes, you know? And maybe that's what the game is trying to tell you to do. Like don't rely on the tech, just observe your environment. But the first thing I do when I've played this game maybe 10 times is I go into my backpack and I unequip all of that, like the sonar and all that crap. Because I'm just like, I'm not going to use any of this stuff. It's just hogging up my inventory space.
Yeah, so it's interesting now. I'm thinking, I mean, one thing that I definitely noticed that was pretty different as well is that, um, I mean, you have to eat stuff, right? So you have to eat snakes and frogs and all sorts of things. And it's pretty funny because Snake uh, will respond with disgust or saying that it was tasty or whatever, and then you'll have a little note for next time whether it was good or tasted terrible or something. And also at one point, I think I ate a mushroom, and then Snake had the munchies, which just is kind of incongruous in the first place, but then also just he was like speaking out loud, so I had to keep eating things so that the guards wouldn't hear him. And I don't know if that's happened to you at all playing the game, but I'm pretty sure it was after eating some kind of mushroom. But the thing is, you eat all this stuff, but it regenerates your stamina, not your health. So one thing that I found that was really different in the game was that there's not as much that will you can get like a life something. I forget what it's called. It's you don't
Like
regain
that.
health. Yeah, yeah, and but you don't regain health from rations anymore. The rations actually taste terrible or whatever, especially the Russian ones. Um, but your health does slowly regenerate. So that mechanic was pretty different. And I'd also say that I agree about the items. I think I used maybe the sonar during one battle and probably the thermal, thermal goggles or whatever a couple times, but a lot of it I just never touched because for one, you can only equip one of those. You can equip something on the left side and one thing on the right side. The right side is for your weapons, right? So you can only kind of equip one of those things at a time, and generally, for me at least, the way that I play, I want it to be something that I can just passively have on. Like I hate kind of going back and forth between things, especially in combat. Um, but that seems also kind of like a very odd and maybe, fickle concession to realism or something like that. Because at the same time in this game, you have so many more guns. Like I ended the game with I don't know how many guns, probably close to 10. And somehow I'm carrying all of those, but I can only equip like radar or this or whatever on my left hand side, one thing at a time. So
I
it
mean,
is
dude,
interesting. Sorry, what?
I was gonna say it makes sense. It's like when you're going out and you put some stuff in like the bottom of your backpack and then some stuff in your pocket, and it's like you would be deranged or maybe, I don't know, healthy if you put your cell phone at the very bottom of your backpack, but then put like a screwdriver in your pocket or something, you
Yeah.
know? Like or you put your umbrella, like you held your umbrella in your hand even if it wasn't raining, but then you put your like wallet at like the most hardest the most difficult to access section of your pack.
Yeah.
I suppose that's what it's trying to simulate, or gesturing towards, but of course it doesn't make any sense because it's like you have a bazooka, in
Right.
your backpack, but then you have a shotgun, like shotgun and three assault rifles like in your hands or on your person or something.
Yeah.
Why don't we take a step back then and can you talk us through or talk me through like your initial impressions of Metal Gear Solid 3? That's where we started with 2, and
Mhm.
I imagine it was quite different in that going into 2 you had very little context, and going into 3, Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 are the two games that are closest gameplay wise
Mhm.
and representationally in the entire series.
Right.
Um, because 1, 4, 5 all happen on different console generations.
Yeah, so I did feel I definitely felt way more prepared to play it, and I think, my playthrough time was probably comparable, like a similar amount of time, but I definitely got through three a bit more quickly. Um, and I also kind of anticipated, I think, a lot of at least the sense of the plot that I would be getting there, like you're kind of dropped off, you jump out of a plane at the beginning, and uh clearly it seems like some kind of nod back to two because you're Snake, but you're wearing like a Raiden mask. So you like think it's Raiden at first. It's like a flip of what happens in two, I guess. Um I do think that part of, just purely in a personal level, thinking about the gameplay, and the setting of the game, much of it happens in the jungle, and I mean, one, I guess, mechanic that is new is also your camouflage, which I found pretty interesting. Like you actually see which again is totally unrealistic. You can see how much percentage of camouflage you have given what kind of outfit you're wearing and whether you're moving or if you're prone or whatever. Um, and there are also these sections where you need to use like scientists' outfit to sneak into these facilities. Um, in a way, I guess it feels more because I know this is like the subtitle, at least of two. I forget if it's the subtitle of three, but it does feel in some ways more tactical,
Mhm.
like especially given that you can complete boss battles non-lethally, so you don't have to kill, I think, any of the bosses, which is something that really you get kind of reminded of with is it the fear or not the fear, the sorrow, that boss battle in quotation marks where you're just seeing the whole stream of everybody that you've killed in the game, and it's just kind of interminable depending on how many people you kill, which I just would kill kind of anyone. But yeah, I feel like I'm kind of jumping around. I mean, I think it's similar enough that the differences seem pretty calculated.
Mhm.
But I haven't played. I've only now played two and three, so I don't know really anything about the other games in the series.
Yeah. I mean, the jungle setting is really striking. And I think today we're somewhat habituated to natural environments. Games have gotten a lot better at representing them. Although, again, very few games represent natural environments in the way that Snake Eater does.
Mm.
Even to the point of having just all of this interactable wildlife. The closest comp to me is something like Monster Hunter, actually, is like if you imagined a Dark Souls game that had a Snake Eater-esque ecosystem and biome, that's sort of like how Monster Hunter feels to play. Because there are all these like little bugs and little creatures and plants, and all of that stuff is interactable and does something very precise
Mhm.
and distinct. Um, but at the time, like I think the jungle was the number one thing that differentiated Metal Gear Solid 3. Not just in the series, but like among big budget action games. If you flash back to like 2004, I mean, in the PS1, PS2 generation, like outdoor environments were just extremely primitive and abstract. Um,
Yep.
I mean, I think PS1 is the best example, or N64, in that like an outdoor environment would very often just feel like an indoor environment insofar it was entirely geometric.
Hmm.
So you'd have like, okay, so here like the cubes and rectangles that you are jumping on and crawling over are green and brown. They're not gray, right?
Right.
And black, but you're still just kind of in this world composed of rectangles or very simplistic geometric shapes.
Sure.
In Metal Gear Solid 3 has a little bit of that. You know, you lean up against a tree and it feels a little bit like leaning up against a wall.
Hmm.
But it really, I think, to its credit, it really breaks away from that strictly geometric model of structuring environments that has completely defined the series. And in fact, when you finally get to a Metal Gear Solid 2 and 1-esque environment, when you get to the base, you know, after the desert, it's really disorienting and you feel really naked. And you like it's I like when I play that part, I'm always like, well, where's my grass? Like where is like my cover? It feels disempowering to finally go to the kind of environment that was like your you know, home sweet home for Solid Snake. So I think one of the great achievements of this game is simply how complex, how non-rectangular, even, you know, if the maps are overall still somewhat geometric, like how non-rectangular the jungle in Snake Eater is.
Yeah, and I guess I'd also say too that I mean, there were times in Metal Gear Solid 2 where I was a little bit unclear on where to go. More specifically, actually, in the very first part where you're playing as Snake, there were some times where I wasn't really sure like where to go. I think in Metal Gear Solid 3, there were a few times where I was totally sort of turned around and confused about kind of what to do next, right? Especially near the end of the game. Um, it also feels like there are just more boss battles. I don't know. I guess you could just count and see, but I'm pretty sure there are like quite a few more
Yeah.
in Metal Gear Solid 3, and they're all I think we kind of talked about this maybe already. They're all kind of gimmicky in their own way, right? Sometimes kind of funny in funny ways. One thing that maybe I'll say in this, and I'm sure this is something that we're going to talk about more. This is something that we sort of talked about a little bit last time, but Ocelot keeps showing up, and every time he shows up, he's always doing various forms of gunplay, whether he's like twirling his gun around on his finger or juggling multiple guns or inviting people to play a sort of Russian roulette with him, kind of. Uh, and so I'm still trying to this is like one of the characters I'm still thinking about. And of course the boss is like a really striking character that I'm sure we'll talk more about as well. But just, both in terms of a humorous but also pathologically obsessed with chance character Ocelot is was a really, striking part of the game.
Yeah, that might be a good place to end. We've circled back to chance and to, I mean, one of your abiding themes, I think, of your work too. We've talked about this before, but I do want to say, and I meant to say this last week too when you brought up Ocelot, but just how funny it is that he is so insistent on this game whenever he walks into a room. Like it would be if it's as if I had this fixation on like Connect 4, and every time I like met you, I was like, oh, or I met anybody, I was like, hold on, like busted out my like Pocket Connect 4 and was like, before we do anything, we need to play a game of this.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know, because he really forces that game on you, and often at like really inappropriate moments. Like there'll be
yeah,
this tense kind of confrontation or argument, and he'll come in with his like Russian roulette game and just demand that somebody play with him. It's a kind of like antisocial like behavior or something, but also very sort of outward and socially directed. You know, it's about relationships with people, and it demands a kind of, you
yeah.
know, it demands a certain kind of relationship, and that's the note you end on with Ocelot too. Is the final thing you do is you go into this fake boss battle, which
Yeah.
is just the roulette game again, and
What?
it's so excessive and seems so anticlimactic because it's like nothing is decided in that moment,
Mhm.
and you've already beaten the game and you've defeated the final boss, but then Ocelot's like, but wait, you
Yeah.
know, we're gonna play this game one more time. And then the game for the first time, I think, shifts into an actual combat interface
Yeah.
for the final iteration.
And he seems, I mean, it strikes me too that it's maybe kind of, I wonder if this holds any water, but it's maybe kind of like a dandy-ish thing to go around constantly challenging people to Russian roulette, you know? It seems like something that you would see someone in an Oscar Wilde novel doing or something like that.
Yeah, or Day-Sans, or is that his name? In
Oh yeah, yeah,
like
yeah, 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 and Against Nature, yeah, yeah. Just forcing his servants to play Russian roulette. Yeah,
Great. Well, I think we can just should we just wrap here?
sure. Yeah,
I forgot to think of an outro, but we don't need one.
yeah,
Yeah, let's just say yeah, we'll come back to Metal Gear Solid 3 and talk about it with a guest and see where we go after that. But until then, Brian, keep that magic lantern lit.
yes. In fact, next time you see me, I may have my magic lantern visibly lit right beside me.
I can't wait.